Hi everyone. This video lecture is to provide you with an additional resource for thinking about systems of power and privilege. We'll do a couple of things today. First, we'll reflect back on a couple of the ideas from Chapter 1, and then we'll unpack some of the key points from Chapter 2, including intersectionality, systems, institutions, and ideologies. From chapter one of the things that was discussed in this chapter and that also came up in the introduction assignment where you talked about some ideas about feminism and what people think about feminists is the myths about feminism from chapter 1. So some of these myths identified in your textbook include feminists are angry, they have an axe to grind or a bone to pick. They have no sense of humor. And some of you may have experienced this when you didn't laugh at a sexist comment, somebody saying, oh, come on, have a sense of humor. A second myth is that feminists hate men and want to have power over them. Or similarly, that feminists only want to be men, that they don't want to be women anymore. They're just man-hating lesbians, right? We've probably heard that phrase before to describe feminists. And all of these critiques relate to the idea that feminists are somehow not feminine enough. Another myth is that feminists have destroyed the institution of motherhood by, fighting for jobs outside of the home and those kinds of things. And as your textbook authors discuss, this isn't really the case because feminists have worked hard to expand the institution of motherhood and to expand the rights of all individuals as they relate to raising children and working. And so things like men's rights to paternal leave when children are born, things like that, which our country, as you'll learn about in later chapters, we really don't have a very good set of formalized rights for mothers and parents anyway. In fact, some second wave feminists said that they think that the failure to kind of institutionalize free daycare um, was a real limitation of feminist gains in the 1970s. So that topic of motherhood and reproductive labor, that'll be the focus of another chapter later on. The final myth here is that feminists are all white and middle class. So that feminism really only applies to a specific set of women. And one of the things that the textbook discusses is that there is some maybe grain of truth to a few of these sentiments insofar as they relate to feminist activism of times past. And so in your chapter 1, you learned about these different types of feminism, including radical feminism. There were things like separatist feminism, where women did want to live away from men. And so some of these early forms of activism, you can see their connection to some of what have been identified here as myths. And similarly, the involvement of white and middle class women in feminist activism at the expense of excluding the experiences of other women, that was one of the limitations of feminist activism in earlier eras. And that's why some women of color don't always identify with the label of feminist, but rather choose other terms to describe their activism involving their own identity as women and also as racialized women or as women who have different experiences than the dominant concerns of feminism, especially during the second wave. A couple other things that I think are useful to think about from chapter 1 is the statement, the personal is political. And I've asked here a couple of reflection questions. The first one is, what did the personal is political mean to feminist activists during the second wave? And that's something that really I hope you took away from your chapter 1 discussion, is that this idea of connecting individual experiences with larger social systems was integral to feminist activism and continues to be so. And the idea of this slogan really is that one woman's individual experience reflects larger social systems of oppression. So, for example, if a woman is being abused by a male partner, then that's not just a personal problem, but it's also reflective of a larger system. And for this reason, solutions also need to come from the systemic or structural level in order to create change. And then I've also asked to for you to think about here, what does this slogan mean to you? So what areas of your life do you feel you face inequality or challenges? How do these relate to your sex, your gender identity or gender expression, your sexuality? And then how do these individual experiences that you've had connect to larger social structures and practices? Sorry, I'm trying to move this little video around here for you. Okay, moving on to key ideas from chapter 2. So, chapter 2 really wants us to think about questions like how power works in society and how are systems of power institutionalized? How are differences ranked or valued compared to one another? And how do systems of difference intersect? And then, how do privilege and discrimination operate? And one of the things that Chapter 2 seeks to provide us with is a common language to address systems of oppression. So I've included this link here for you to this great video, Intersectionality, Feminism, and Pizza. I'm going to take a chance and see if the audio will record on this video. All right, so there we had a little video discussion of intersectionality using the metaphor of pizza. Now, let me see if I can get out of these slides where I'm stuck. There we go. All right. So this discussion of intersectionality, I think it ties really well to figure 2.1 in your textbook, which is that figure where you see all those different axes of oppression intersecting with one another. And then you've got a line across the middle, and you see that the characteristics on the top of that line are valued more than the characteristics on the bottom of that line, or they have more power in society than the characteristics on the bottom of that line. So in that figure, you'll see axes including gender, but you'll see axes of religion, of race, of class, of ability, and so much more. And as we talked about briefly in the optional meeting last week, um, this relates to Kimberly Crenshaw's metaphor of the intersection for understanding identities. And what she talked about specifically was when accidents occur in an intersection. And she said the accidents occur where the roads meet. It's not just one road, it's a combination of all these things that contributes to the crash. And that crash describes systems of oppression that women, men, and all individuals face based on aspects of their identity. So, a couple of the things to understand as it relates to these systems. One is that this is what a lot of prejudice is based on. And the definition here of prejudice, prejudging somebody without adequate or accurate information, we do this on the basis of these axes of identity. Also, it's can be incredibly difficult to kind of locate oneself in terms of our oppression, our privilege, our challenges that we face. It's hard to think about where we fall intersectionally because even when you look at that drawing, that figure 2.1, there's so much going on there, right? So you could be above the line on this axis, on the axis of ability. You could be above the line on the axis of education. You could be above the line on the axis of appearance privilege, i.e., how attractive are you? But then you could fall below the line on something like your social class if you were raised in a lower class or poor environment, then you didn't have privilege in that regard. So it's hard to think complexly about how do all of these different systems intersect and impact one another. But one of the key things that we want to understand is the way that the individual and our kinds of micro experiences exist within these macro societal systems. And these systems are comprised of institutions and ideologies. So, when we talk about institutions, we're talking about material dimensions of oppression. Institutions is the name given to social organizations that involve established patterns of behavior and that function through social norms. We can think of institutions as some of the kind of formal organizations in society. So, the university is an institution. Um, Corporations and basically any workplace is an institution. The political system is an institution. Religions and individual churches are institutions. The prison system is an institution. The legal system is an institution, and so on and so forth. So these are those kinds of material organizations that they produce and replicate existing power structures, and they also at times offer ways of challenging those structures. And so our institutions change over time as our rights and experiences have changed over time. So we now have, for example, women working in various fields and workplaces that they weren't a part of not all that long ago. So that's a change in institutions that reflects a change in the social order. At the same time, we can also see that certain occupations continue to be segregated, or when we think about something like the wage gap, there we see this continuity in institutions that indicates a still existing aspect of oppression. So these kinds of formal organizations are central in creating systems of inequality and privilege. Moreover, major institutions are interconnected and they support one another. So, for example, capitalism is another very big institution. But we can think about capitalism as being interconnected with the institution of politics. Why? Because being successful politically requires fundraising, it requires a lot of monetary support, and this is why oftentimes people in politics come from places of class privilege already. And they've also had more access to elite universities. So, another interconnection with another institution. Another definition here is for the word institutionalization. And when we talk about the institutionalization of something, we're talking about the ways that systems and sets of practices replicate one another. So let me give you some examples. When we think about institutionalization, or we hear that word, let's use that word to think about institutionalized oppressions generally. So, if we were together, I would ask you for some examples here, but I'll see if I can come up with some for you. So, institutionalized sexism, for example, would be if a woman is not eligible for a particular position or is overlooked for a particular position given the fact that she is a mother. And for that reason, the organization or the institution feels that her schedule would not allow her to be available enough for the job. So, in that way, this kind of hierarchy of power is replicated through the system. Institutionalized racism. This is one that has been very visible in the media over the past several months. And so, institutionalized racism, we can see in the unfair actions within our criminal justice system. We can see in the violence and killing, the deaths of Black people at the hands of the system is a very strong example of institutionalized racism. Um, Also, when we look at the statistics on prison populations, we see very visible evidence of institutionalized racism insofar as the majority of prisoners are not white. And they also are not women. So, in this case, we see an institutionalization of oppression where we see men more in a certain position than women. And this isn't a desirable position, right, of being in jail. So, gender studies scholars often say that we need to look at women are like absent or left out of things that they should be included in, but we also need to look at places where men are overrepresented because these systems of gender impact everybody, not just women. Examples of institutionalized cis heteronormativity. All right, so this is a big word here, but cis heteronormativity has to do with the privilege given to people whose gender expression identifies with their biological sex and whose sexuality, who they're attracted to, is opposite sex from that. So when we have, you know, the institution of marriage proclaiming, I now pronounce you man and wife. That is a long standing institutionalization of cis heteronormativity that privileges certain bodies and gender expressions and says those are the ideal partners. We have a lot of other institutionalized isms. So when you look at that figure 2.1 of those different axes, go ahead and spend some time thinking about how do these show up in our social structures and practices. Okay, also important to understanding systems are ideologies and how ideologies uphold and reinforce systems. So, if institutions are the material dimension of oppression, ideologies are the symbolic dimension of oppression. And these institutions that we've been discussing, they produce messages that shape our understanding. So, ideology, as defined here, refers to the messages that circulate and form our belief systems, and they impact us into kind of taking certain things to be common sense that we don't question. Ideologies are reproduced through our language and our symbol systems. So there's various institutions that I've mentioned. They impact our language. They impact our symbols. So if we think about the institution of religion, for example, there are certain phrases in the American language or even written on dollar bills, for example, in God we trust. And so we have our language reproducing Christianity as a dominant system, even as we have laws and expressions that all religions are equal and that we support the practice of all religions, we still have Christianity as a privileged religion. And so that's reproduced in our language. The example of the phrase man and wife was another example of how our language has reflected a certain ideology. And again, we can also see changes in our social structures and systems in our changes in language. So, for example, when I was growing up, a lot of mail was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Clyde Chevrette, my dad's name. And that practice may continue some today, but I think it is also becoming a little bit less common that a woman would be called Mrs. and then her husband's full name. So we see some shift there as well as some continuities. Ideologies are also reproduced through stereotypes and controlling images. And so we can think here about various kinds of archetypes, like even the fairy tale love story. It's a very gendered story, really, in children's fairy tales, in, excuse me, in a lot of old Disney movies. uh, beautiful, helpless woman gets saved by a man and everything's hunky dory after that and amazing. So that's an example of how ideologies are reproduced. images as well. I wrote a book recently that came out over the summer called Dangerous Dames, and it looked at the kind of pretty popular mediated representation of the sexy, ass-kicking woman hero figure. So we wrote about characters ranging from Kill Bill, Uma Thurman's character, the bride in Kill Bill, or The Hunger Games, or Wonder Woman, and also science fiction representations, and the way that you see this kind of sexualized figure who's also in many ways violating a lot of gender norms because they are violent, they are killing, they are skilled, uh, they are strong. And so in our book, we looked at some of the paradoxes of this kind of figure. So when we think about the way that ideologies are reproduced in these various ways, what we're really talking about is the relationships between discourse, that is the messages that circulate in society, power, the organization of power within our society, and knowledge, what we know and what we're able to know as it relates to discourse and power. All right, so the final thing that I wanted to touch on for you is a resource that I think is very helpful for your Chapter 2 assignment, and that is Arizona State University's Project Humanities Perils and Perks of Privilege. So on this website, they have a bunch of checklists related to privilege, and they keep it pretty current and updated. So you'll find white privilege there. You'll find a list of male privilege there. You'll find a list of ability privilege or weight privilege. They even have a new one that is a list of pandemic privilege. So take a look at that, and you can use that to assist you on your Chapter 2 assignment, which you'll see requires you to reflect on your own privileges. One of the ways that I would suggest approaching this assignment is to spend some time after you read the chapter thinking on those questions, using these checklists, like I said, and reflecting on your privilege and lack of privilege in other areas. And then once you've done that kind of reflection, you can start to answer those questions based on your individual experiences and reactions, and then go back to the textbook and weave in the points from the textbook that help unpack and support what you're saying there. So much like this overall discussion, for this assignment, you can start with the individual and then connect it to these larger systems. All right? So feel free to be in touch with thoughts and questions, and I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye now.